Hi, I'm Chris McNulty, Senior Product Manager for SharePoint and OneDrive at Microsoft. Over the past decade, as part of digital transformation, organizations have increasingly turned to the cloud to help manage their burgeoning arsenal of digital content. Content has always been king, but as we've seen organizations move from petabytes to zettabytes and beyond, struggling with this is expected to be a challenge for years to come. However, many organizations have learned greatly from patterns of the past. That's why today Microsoft is joined by three visionaries from the world of content. Today we have John Mancini, Chairman Emeritus of AIIM, Cheryl McKinnon, Principal Analyst at Forrester Research, and Ian Story, Principal Program Manager for Microsoft. So John, welcome.
Good to be here, Chris.
Tell me a little about how you got started in this wonderful world of content.
I started with AIIM about 25 years ago, and the focus then was on documents and workflow, and so we migrated the organization to focus more on web-based technologies, and now increasingly on more technologies focused on what we call intelligent information management. So it's been a long journey, a lot of changes, but at the core has always been people, process, and technology.
So Cheryl, you're a Principal Analyst at Forrester Research.
I am.
How did you come to be part of this wonderful world of content?
Well, I actually started as a history major. I didn't come from a technology background.
Interesting.
And I started to realize through a series of summer jobs doing my master's that the world was going digital. So I kind of pivoted into the technology world just to understand how we're going to be able to preserve and protect a lot of our digital heritage.
So Ian, as Principal Program Manager at Microsoft, although I'm not sure everyone understands what that means in your day-to-day.
Sure. So I sit on the leadership team for SharePoint and OneDrive, and I have three primary functions. The first is working with customers. Second is working with partners. Third is working with analysts. And in my spare time, I'm also Microsoft's representative on the AIIM board of directors.
Any history that you want to share with us?
Well, I've started in this industry 20 years ago. At a manufacturing organization. I was a customer, warehouser, and I worked on a tool there called Content Services. From there, I went into banking, Washington Mutual, and then JP Morgan Chase. And then I spent a few years working for a competitor of Microsoft's, IBM, also a partner, of course. And then I joined Microsoft a couple years ago.
So we talked about enterprise content management, ECM, and that's traditionally the name given to this discipline. But increasingly, we've seen the rise of other terminology, intelligent information management, content services. What do we think is going on there? Is this just a new name for the same process, or is there something really transformative going on?
Well, I think there's something really transformative going on here. I think when you go back to ECM, it was really conceived in the era in which people were trying to automate very specific document-intensive, very complicated processes. And that worked well in that environment. Things like new drug application processes and insurance claim processing and things like that. I would never think of it as a market segment. I would think of it as a description of things that people are trying to do with content and information.
So I think regardless of whether we're talking about this as a process or as a tool set or as an end result, I think we all agree we're talking about content here. But what's interesting is I think there's also been an evolution in what is content and what is not.
That's a good question. It used to be easy. It used to be that content was the unstructured documents that were kind of in contrast to more structured data that was held in rows and columns of a database. And now two things have occurred. One is that all those lines that existed between structured and unstructured content, if they ever really meant anything to users, are all blurred, and nobody really cares what the difference is. And the kinds of content isn't just document anymore, and it's not just Office files anymore. It can be video, it can be audio, it can be all sorts of different things. And so it has gotten to be, I think actually information that encompasses both data and content is probably a better description of what we're talking about.
Cheryl, do you think the document is still going to be as prevalent a format in 20 years?
I think the document will be a prevalent format, but I think the equivalent of a document equals a file is the part that is starting to erode as we see a lot more of the online and software as a service authoring tools, things that allow a lot of collaboration and co-creation activities. I mean, these aren't often files until we choose to export them.
Cheryl, do you think in 10 years organizations will have more or fewer repositories than they have now?
So, I actually wrote a little bit last year about, are we shifting to this, post-repository world where the repository becomes less and less, the value add of a content management platform. And what's really important is, do we have the connectivity to federate or interoperate so we can pull content from multiple systems, but hide the complexity from the day-to-day information worker and just present what they need to complete a task, through their mobile app or through an alternative line of business application or in their office productivity tool of choice.
So we know being in the cloud has been a trend for years. In Office 365 alone, Microsoft has over 400,000 customers who are using it. Is the cloud truly transformative, or is it just another data center?
When we used to survey people 3-4 years ago, and particularly an AIIM audience, which is very focused on control and access to content and information and records,
right,
and we would ask them whether the cloud was part of their strategy, people wouldn't just say no, they would say hell no. And when we look at it now, 82% say when they look at the primary direction of their efforts in the next 2 years, 82% say it's in the direction of either the cloud or a hybrid cloud on-prem strategy.
Don't you find there are also some organizations who try to do exactly the same things in the cloud that they were doing on premises, who'd say the cloud is a big enough change?
I think really what's going on is that people want choice. Even organizations that tend to be biased towards an on-prem approach, they want to have that as an option out there. So having both sets of capabilities, I think, becomes really, really critical moving forward.
So both sets.
Yeah.
Cheryl, do you agree?
I do, actually, and we've got data that shows that the tipping point in terms of having most enterprise content management deployments on premises has now shifted to more hybrid and hosted, moving towards software as a service. So I think this hybrid world is where we're going to be living for the next few years as organizations are at different stages of a roadmap to cloud.
So you mentioned a couple of years. Do you think that it's ever a permanent trend to be hybrid?
I think it's going to be here for a few years. Permanent, not necessarily. I think as organizations take a look at what are their more complex content or process management workloads. For example, if they have deep integrations to other on-premises line of business applications, that's a lot tougher to just move into a cloud service overnight, where spinning up a new project team or a new corporate intranet site, that's much easier to do net new, kind of clean slate in a cloud application.
So Ian, have you run across any customers who aren't trying hard enough in the cloud, I guess I'd say?
I'd say from a content management point of view, most of our customers are either in the cloud or moving toward the cloud aggressively. But to Cheryl's point, there are a lot of other systems that they have, their ERP systems and CRM systems and, custom things that they've built in their organizations and so forth that are on-prem and will be on-prem for a long time. And they're struggling with how to move those to the cloud as well. The other thing I would say is the customers that have really heavily customized their on-prem deployments of content management tools, ripped out the code that was provided by the vendor and written their own code, their own UIs, their own integration points and so forth. They tend to struggle the most because, oftentimes moving to the cloud, you can't necessarily change all the code that's in the SaaS offering that's provided by the vendor.
And I think it really goes a long way in terms of helping solve kind of the perennial challenge in the content management space around user adoption. Because so many of the historical deployments have been on premises, highly customized, they are hard to upgrade.
So we're talking about some, fear and reluctance, or even fear and loathing about the cloud. But with that, I think there still are legitimate reasons why organizations need to keep some of their uses and some of their content on premises. What are some of the good ones that each of you have heard?
When I talk to some public sector, government agencies and highly regulated agencies, especially, if we look into Europe, for example, if they don't have the confidence that they've got a local vendor that can provide, in-country data residency requirements for sensitive information, then they'll often choose to stay on premises until they have that comfort.
The security kinds of things that Cheryl talked about, and particularly the data residency side, as that gets more and more complex over time and as geographies step in to put their brand on where they want data to be, that becomes another issue why some people say, well, in this case, we'll keep it on-prem.
So GDPR has recently gone into effect in the European Union. And it reminds me in many regards of some of the focus nearly 20 years ago on Y2K, that there's both risk and opportunity with something like GDPR. Cheryl, what do you see as some of the advantages to the organization of having to comply with GDPR?
Well, I think first off, it kind of compels organizations to really understand their end-to-end content and data holdings. Build out that map so they know where any kind of risky content might reside, or any other employee or customer confidential information. Where does it actually reside, and can we retrieve it, secure it, and potentially even destroy or disclose it, depending on the requests.
And it's not an insignificant undertaking at scale. The survey that I did, basically people came back and said, on average, they thought it would cost 4,800 euro to find all the information about a customer and deliver it in machine-readable format back to that customer. Well, you start multiplying that times the number of requests that people are going to get, and it really puts an incentive on people to get serious about how they manage their information.
When you look at the industry, certainly Microsoft is not alone in using AI and cognitive services to help enrich the entire part of the content experience. Do we think that this is going to become something that is not just prevalent, but pervasive and noticeable, or something that becomes a background service that we just take for granted, like printing?
Even though it seems like we've been doing it forever, when it comes to sub-processes, is really in its very early stages.
Right.
And I think automation and artificial intelligence is going to pave the way for that and make those engines much more powerful in the future.
And I think we also are going to bump up against, kind of some of the contradictions in terms of how we have managed information over the last couple of decades. I mean, for organizations with very aggressive retention and disposal policies from a records management perspective, I mean, they're missing huge swaths of what could be potential useful signals and sources to be mined as part of this. So you're just keeping kind of a small subset of the records because it's less expensive to do e-discovery. You're also missing a big chunk of your corporate memory that could actually contribute to some of the findings and analysis. And think about organizations with still large paper stores. If you can go back 10 years in terms of digital contracts for your customers, great. Well, what if you can go back 50? Because you've actually been able to digitize and extract information that can lead to more intelligent decisions going back over longer periods of time, because you've done that conversion.
So compliance and records management and retention have long been, pillars of how we manage information at scale, on premises or in the cloud. How do you see that as a discipline evolving over the next 10 years?
Well, I think that there's a lot of opportunity, as we just talked about, moving into, more of using the algorithms, understanding what is the right kind of algorithm to do different kinds of categorization, classification. I think that these roles, because they're often subject matter experts in their particular lines of businesses, they understand the corporate taxonomy, how they've been using things like metadata, could be in a very good position to be, kind of the trainers of the algorithms going forward, rather than just the retainers of the records.
I think there's an intense need for simplification as well. I think we over-pivoted, or the pendulum swung a little too far in the Sarbanes-Oxley days, and large organizations that no longer exist because they kept things longer than they should, or what have you. And it just feels like there's this need for simplification and to streamline the process, make it easier. But I think there's also a need, just generally speaking, to say maybe we'll accept what we think is a little bit more risk by simplifying this and doing big buckets or what have you. But in reality, it's not more risk than having something that's so complicated that nobody follows it.
So if you think about what's going on now with cloud content management as a second wave or a second opportunity for records management, how do we as practitioners and how does the industry as a whole make sure that we don't repeat the risk that our records archives become the warehouse where documents go to die?
I think one of the challenges that we at AIIM have is, okay, how do you take a lot of those practices that were traditionally defined in an on-prem world,
right,
and migrate those into a cloud environment so that people don't make the same mistakes they made the first time? Because you're right, we've all seen cloud implementations that turned into just glorified instances of the file share. It's just a horrible dumping ground of junk. And that's not where you really want to get to.
Mm-hmm. I think that we didn't quite get there in the on-premises world because it was too expensive to go back and index the billions and tens of billions and hundreds of billions of documents that I had. I didn't have the compute compute capacity to do that and so forth. I think the cloud will open that door up with the scalability and the compute capacity that you have in the cloud.
And I think it also opens the door, in addition to all of the scale performance advantages, especially at large scale, the ability to have that information more broadly accessible, shareable by other parts of the organization, even by members of what I often have been calling the extended enterprise. So you've got critical suppliers, partners, even customers can benefit from that information, and trying to share that securely in on-prem systems can be much more difficult than if you can open up a door to certain segments of your cloud content management.
So looking forward, there's obviously been a lot of innovation that's come up in the last few years, as well as things that are likely to come up in the next few years. What's something that excites you about the next 10 years? Something you've seen or that you really can't wait to see that we as an industry get it right?
When you start to think about 5 years from now, how are people going to interface with our content systems? How are they going to interface with processes? What are millennials going to expect in terms of an interface? Are they really going to be sitting there typing into a laptop? Going to change a lot. And I think it's going to be really exciting to see what happens there.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Just the opening of new ways of creating and generating that content to begin with, including using AI services to generate news articles, summaries. I mean, it sounds a little bit crazy, but this concept of knowledge management has come roaring back with a vengeance in the customer calls I've had over the last few months. And I've referred to this as kind of information FOMO, that fear of missing out, because they know this stuff exists. They just don't know how to get to it, where it resides. And I think the opportunity to kind of mine into multiple systems, structured or unstructured, it really kind of opens up the door to new ways of knowledge delivery to people who are really thirsting for insights. The thing that terrifies me also is this area of digital preservation. And John, I know you've been talking about this, but I just think that we are underestimating the fragility of a lot of our digital artifacts. Are we going to be able to look at this, preserve it, access it in 10, 15, 50 years down the road? This is my historian hat coming back out. But also even things, tactical like link rot, right? We rely on online information so often. We embed links in our email and our documents. And, there's some data out there that shows, if you look at scientific legal journals, I mean, a third of that is already dead links. So we really need to think about this stuff.
There was something I read once about, they were predicting 100 years from now, there'll be two kinds of digital archaeologists, hard and soft. The soft will be experts in missing file formats. The hard ones will tell you how to make that BlackBerry work again.
So when I think 10 years out, I'd combine the two things. John talking about voice and new ways to interact, and Cheryl talking about knowledge management and preserving that knowledge. I think we're quickly heading down a path where you've got embedded and wearable devices and so forth, not just me wearing one on my wrist, but much more interesting use cases there. Elon Musk and many of the other leaders in the industry are looking at brain interfaces to computers and so forth. So being able to interact in new ways, whether it's voice, whether it's something wearable, whether it's something implantable, and then having access to all that information, I think that's going to just completely change again the way things work.
Well, I just wanted to say thank you very much for joining us here today. This has been a really interesting and educational conversation for me, and I hope for those of you watching out there. Once again, I'd like to also thank John Mancini.
Thanks for having me, Chris.
Cheryl McKinnon, and Ian Story.
Great to be here.
Please keep watching for more information here from Microsoft. Thank you.